Caving is one thing that I am personally scared of. It takes years and years of practice and even those years of experience. What if the cave decides to close up and lock you inside? What if there is no reception down below? Are you going to make it out of there, or will that forever be your grave? Here are 3 stories that left me on edge. At some point, I gnarled my teeth and chewed my nails. I've never had to warn my viewers, but today, viewers' discretion is advised. On April 22, 2023, the unexpected happened. It literally dropped my jaw, and what started as a simple family outing for 49-year-old Carl O'Keefe turned into a nightmare in the blink of an eye. Carl, a father of 3, visited the Kong Adventure Center in Keswick, England, with plans for a day of celebration and adventure. He entered their indoor caving system, a labyrinth of tight, man-made tunnels designed to thrill. But for Carl, this was no thrill. Maybe it was at first, but at the latter end, it became a tragic and fatal experience. A day meant for joy and bonding turned into a horrifying fight for survival. Carl O'Keefe was not a stranger to adventure. With a background in climbing and caving, he possessed the physical strength, mental focus, and careful judgment required for such activities. His family described him as a brilliant man, a devoted father, and a strong advocate for the neurodiverse community. Known for his characteristic dark glasses worn due to photophobia, Carl was also about to start a PhD in astrophysics. His future seemed limitless, a journey of exploration in both the physical and intellectual realms. On this April day, Carl joined his children, his sister, and his niece to celebrate his niece's birthday at the Kong Adventure Center, which is located in the scenic Lake District. The center is well known for its range of activities, including climbing walls, outdoor adventures, and a very finely and precisely made fiberglass caving system. The caves, marketed as family-friendly, had, however, drawn mixed reviews. Previous visitors often remarked on the tightness of the tunnels, warning that they might be too small for adults. For kids, it was an exciting playground. For adults, it could be a claustrophobic challenge. Some proclaimed that at some point in the tunnels, you might feel like the walls are closing in on you. You might feel like the air is getting thinner, and you might just begin to panic. And with that shortness of breath, only Mother Nature knows what is going to happen. Carl and the kids entered, eager to explore. The children, light, nimble, slender, and tiny, navigated the passages with ease, laughing as they crawled through the narrow spaces. For Carl, the experience quickly turned into a struggle. Despite being of average build, he found himself grappling with the unforgiving design of the tunnels. Some reports suggest he tripped and fell into a crevice, while others claim he became wedged while attempting to turn in a narrow section. Either way, Carl was firmly stuck, and the situation escalated from discomfort to danger. As they said, the walls began to feel like they were closing in, and every passing second felt like the air was thinning out with every breath. Noticing his distress, Carl's children alerted the adults, who immediately informed the staff. Panic rippled through the group as the reality of the situation set in. Staff members rushed to the scene, initially attempting to free Carl using ropes and physical force. Their efforts were earnest, but the means proved futile. Recognizing the severity of the situation, they called emergency services. The call to 999 triggered a massive response. Police, fire departments, the Keswick Mountain Rescue Team, and the Hazardous Area Response Team all converged on the scene. The operation was complex and urgent. By this point, Carl had been trapped in a static position for over an hour. His breathing had lost pattern, and he was already fighting to breathe every breath he could at the moment, and the strain on his body was evident. Time was running out. Staff and visitors were desperate to help, and they began dismantling the climbing wall panels to access the hidden tunnels. This was no small feat. The caving system, crafted from durable fiberglass, required specialized cutting equipment to safely remove sections without further risking Carl's life. Over 50 people joined forces in the rescue operation, a remarkable display of teamwork and determination. Every cut had to be precise, and every second was important. A little mistake, and they could fatally hurt him. Every second more, and he could give up his life. The scene was a gruesome mix of urgency and precision. Professionals worked methodically, balancing speed with caution, while Carl's family watched in helpless agony. The children, who moments earlier had been laughing in those very tunnels, were now witnesses to a terrifying reality. For Carl, each passing moment was a battle, not just against the physical confines, but also against the creeping weight of fear. As rescuers cut through the fiberglass, the task proved more challenging than anticipated. The tunnels that were originally designed for excitement had become a prison of torment, holding a grown man against his own will and taking his life from him with each. Each cut had to be precise, avoiding vibrations or movements that could further harm Carl. Meanwhile, medics on site monitored his condition, providing what aid they could under the constrained circumstances. Carl's ordeal was more than a tragedy. It was an agonizing marathon of helplessness for everyone involved. For over 4 hours, rescuers battled against time, determined to free him from the narrow, unforgiving confines of the cave. Meanwhile, Carl's family could only stand by, hearts heavy with despair, watching as hope ebbed with each passing minute. It was the kind of scenario you'd expect to see in a survival movie, except this was all too real. When Carl was finally extricated, it was evident the fight was far from over. He was rushed to the hospital, but the injuries he had sustained were catastrophic. 10 days later, surrounded by his devastated family, Carl succumbed to his wounds. His sister, who had remained by his side throughout the ordeal, described it as the darkest chapter of her life. Witnessing her brother's decline, unable to do anything but hold his hand, left her with emotional scars that would never fade. The aftermath of Carl's death sparked intense scrutiny. Questions emerged about the Kong Adventure Center's caving attraction, a place that marketed itself as family-friendly but seemed to be anything but safe. Online reviews from as far back as 2017 hinted at the danger. One visitor recalled how her husband, who was just under 6 feet tall, had gotten stuck in the caves. She described the incident as terrifying, mentioning the absence of supervision and how unprepared the staff seemed to handle emergencies. Another review bluntly warned that the caves were far too tight for adults, suggesting they should be restricted to children. Despite these red flags, no significant safety measures were implemented before Carl's visit. The Kong Adventure Center seemed to prioritize excitement over caution. The caves, with their narrow tunnels and a single, unforgiving exit, were a disaster waiting to happen. For an adult like Carl, unfamiliar with the layout, the design was not just challenging, it was deadly. The thrill of squeezing through tight spaces, enticing for children, became a trap for anyone larger or less agile. Once trapped, there was little room for maneuvering, let alone escape. Carl's sister didn't hold back when discussing the emotional toll the incident took on her. Her brother had been her best friend, someone she could always rely on. Watching him suffer and feeling utterly powerless to save him was a torment that no one should endure. The grief and trauma etched into her family's lives were profound and unrelenting. The incident was a stark reminder that attractions marketed as fun must also be held accountable for their safety standards. Carl's death wasn't just an unfortunate accident, it was preventable. The tragedy exposed glaring oversights in the facility's safety protocols, or lack thereof, and the absence of any meaningful response to previous complaints. Imagine being in Carl's position, trapped in a suffocatingly tight tunnel, unable to move, the air around you growing heavy, and the darkness pressing in. It's not just the stuff of nightmares, it is the nightmare, and yet, it became his reality. For his family, those harrowing hours waiting for rescue were an emotional roller coaster, each moment oscillating between hope and despair. The relief of seeing him freed was short-lived, replaced by the crushing pain of watching him succumb to his injuries. The Kong Adventure Center faced mounting scrutiny after the tragedy, with investigations launched to determine how such a disaster could occur. Yet, as of now, no meaningful changes have been reported, and the findings of the inquest remain undisclosed. The silence surrounding the issue has only deepened the frustration and grief of those who lost Carl. Carl's story is more than just a cautionary tale, it's a call to action. His life was not defined by this tragedy. He was a father, a brother, and a compassionate soul who believed in uplifting others. His untimely death must serve as a catalyst for change, pushing for stricter safety regulations in recreational facilities. No family should have to endure such a devastating loss because of preventable oversights. For now, Carl's loved ones are left with memories of a life cut short and a void that will never be filled. His sister's words capture the depth of their sorrow. The world lost not just a victim of negligence, but a remarkable person whose absence will be felt forever. The haunting details of this tragedy linger as a stark reminder of the cost of complacency. As you think about this story, consider the fragility of life and the importance of vigilance, even in seemingly safe environments. Carl's story is a sobering reminder that joy and tragedy can exist side by side, separated by moments. His legacy, however, is one of love, intellect, and the hope that lessons will be learnt from his untimely passing. That touched me in dimensions that shook my being. This next story, I can't tell if it will have a better ending. On August 9, 1980, 4 adventurers, Bruce Unger, Scott Tron, Louise Jose, and Tom Strong, entered the Lost Creek cave system in Colorado, unaware of the terror awaiting them. These caves, carved through rocky landscapes near Denver, were both stunning and dangerous. The group had picked a specific cave known as the lowermost cave, which was challenging because no one had ever fully traversed it, from the lower entrance to the upper exit. The allure of being pioneers heightened their excitement, but little did they know that every inch of that journey would be excruciating. Bruce Unger, the leader of the group, was an experienced caver who had ventured into dangerous caves before. He had faced high-flow water systems in the past, but nothing would prepare him for what lay ahead, or better, nature was unforgiving for him daring her. They were determined, and with their peak determination, they equipped themselves well, wearing wetsuits to fend off the icy water and bringing both carbide and electric lamps. They believed they were ready for anything, but so was the cave. It was ready for anything that came into it. The group stepped into the cave entrance at 11:30 a.m., their hearts pounding with anticipation and confidence, fused with their excitement, and it was lovely. As they descended, the echoes of rushing water intensified. The caves tightened around them, forcing them to maneuver through narrow passageways and slippery rocks. Each step tested their nerves. The deeper they went, the more the environment seemed to come alive, almost as if the cave were testing their resolve. It felt like the walls began to choke them in, and slowly it felt like with every inch, it got narrower and narrower. Roughly 150 feet in, they encountered their first major challenge, a powerful water chute. The chute was a 2-foot wide, 15-foot long slope at a sharp angle. Water roared through it like a beast, making the passage treacherous. The chute connected to a larger chamber on the other side, but crossing it would be more than perilous. It would take guts to even think of moving any further, but Bruce was eager. He led the way, climbing in first. Using friction holds on the slippery rock, he battled the strong current, inching upward with every movement and trying to hold on, for he knew that his dear life was on the line. Any little mistake and he would be a goner. He urged caution to those below, warning of the chute's slickness, but then disaster struck. As Bruce was moving up, Bruce lost his footing. The water seized him with fury, dragging him back down the chute with a force so terrifying. His body slammed into the water below, and before he could recover, his left foot became lodged in a crevice. Panic gripped Bruce as he realized his boot was stuck. The water's relentless pressure pinned him, and despite his struggles, he could not free himself. He screamed at the top of his voice for help. His voice was laced with fear and filled with desperation. Desperation to live. Louise Jose scrambled up the chute, reaching him first. She tried desperately to pull his leg free, but the boot was wedged too tightly. Meanwhile, Tron and Strong prepared to assist, but the raging water fought against them. As Louise repositioned herself to help Bruce keep his head above water, she lost her grip. The current swept her down the chute. Nature was unforgiving, and in its grip it had two people, and had the power to decide what would be of their fate. Tron and Strong collided with Louise in the pool below, adding to the confusion. Determined to help, Tron managed to climb back up to Bruce. He grabbed Bruce's hand, holding on as tightly as he could, but the water was relentless, thrashing them both. Bruce's strength waned. He pleaded for help, his voice barely audible over the roaring water. Suddenly, Tron's grip failed. Bruce's head disappeared beneath the surface, and the panic only grew. The current threw Tron back down the chute. The others were now in darkness, their carbide lamps extinguished by the icy water. Only Louise's electric lamp flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the cave walls. Desperation filled the air as they realized Bruce was no longer visible. Tron, refusing to give up, climbed back to Bruce's last position. His heart pounded as he grasped Bruce's helmet, pulling with every ounce of strength. The helmet came off in his hands. Tron's stomach sank as he tried again, but the water hurled him back down the chute once more. Louise and Strong, understanding the dire situation, shed their packs and ropes to move faster. They climbed the chute repeatedly, driven by the slim hope of finding Bruce alive. But the cave seemed to conspire against them, its icy grip tightening with each failed attempt. The water was merciless, a roaring force that swallowed Bruce entirely. Minutes passed, each one an eternity. Exhausted and heartbroken, the group reached the top of the chute again. They stared into the swirling water, the cold reality sinking in. Bruce was gone. At 2:45 p.m., they made the agonizing decision to leave the cave. There was nothing more they could do. The cave had claimed Bruce, and their own survival now depended on escaping its clutches. They exited in silence, their grief heavy. 2 weeks later, a recovery team returned to the cave. The water flow had diminished, revealing Bruce's body wedged beneath a boulder. It took hours of careful effort to free him. The team brought him back to the surface, where an autopsy revealed the cause of death. Bruce had suffered extensive head injuries, including fractures to his skull and neck. These injuries likely resulted from his head repeatedly striking the cave walls as the water dragged him. Drowning seemed less likely. The blunt force trauma had been enough to claim his life. The tragedy raised questions about their preparation and decisions. Bruce's boots, while sturdy, were unsuitable for the slippery cave surfaces. Their lack of a more structured rescue plan also played a role. In their panic, critical options like securing Bruce's head above water were overlooked. Despite these lessons, the cave's dangers remain. The Lost Creek system, while beautiful, is a reminder of nature's unforgiving power. Those who venture into its depths must respect its risks, for it is not just a test of skill, but also a challenge to survive. The story of Bruce Unger is a haunting one. His passion for adventure led him to a place where beauty and danger intertwined, and ultimately, it cost him his life. As his friends left the cave that day, they carried not just the weight of their grief, but also the knowledge that the cave had taken one of its own. On June 14, 2003, two seasoned cavers, Tom Dawson and Bob Sacco, ventured into Colorado's rugged wilderness for what they thought would be a thrilling day of exploration. Their goal was the newly discovered land of the Swirling Mists Cave, an underground labyrinth that had captured the imagination of adventurers. The air was filled with excitement as they prepared to uncover hidden passages and chart the unknown. Deep within the earth, the cave was alive. The sound of dripping water echoed through the dark corridors, the damp air carrying the smell of earth and mystery. Dawson and Sacco pushed forward, their lights casting flickering shadows on the jagged walls. The main level had already been explored, but the south end of the lobby, a massive room filled with unstable rock piles, held untold secrets. Dawson, always seeking a challenge, decided to dig through the unstable pile in hopes of discovering a new tunnel. He lay on his side, pulling rocks away carefully, his body pressed against the cold, damp floor. He avoided the larger rocks, trusting his instincts to keep him safe. The cave felt ominous, the distant echoes amplifying the tension. Without warning, a sickening scrape cut through the air. Time seemed to slow as a massive slab of rock, 10 inches thick and several feet wide, broke loose from the ceiling. It crashed down with terrifying force, pinning Dawson beneath its crushing weight. Pain erupted through Dawson's body. His chest exploded with a sharp, sickening pop as his ribs cracked under the pressure. Each breath became a shallow, jagged gasp, his broken ribs grinding together like knives stabbing into his lungs. A white-hot flash of pain shot through his left shoulder as it dislocated, leaving his arm limp and useless. He was trapped. The cold, unyielding rock pinned him to the cave floor, his right arm awkwardly stretched above his head. His dislocated shoulder throbbed with fiery pain, every tiny movement sending fresh waves of agony. He tried to shift his body, but the weight of the slab pressed down harder with each attempt. Sacco, seeing his friend pinned and crying out, frantically started digging to free him. The slab was relentless, its crushing force intensifying as Sacco removed rocks. Dawson's legs were visible, but his torso and head were completely trapped. The cave seemed to tighten around them, its darkness growing heavier. The slab suddenly shifted, its enormous weight smacking Dawson's helmet and pinning his head in place. His breaths became shallower, his strength fading. His free hand groped for the chin strap of his helmet, his numb fingers desperately trying to release it. With one last effort, he managed to unclip the strap and slide his head out just as the rock slammed into the space where he had been. Dawson's body was a wreck, his ribs burnt from the impact, his dislocated shoulder hung useless, and his head throbbed with pain. He knew he couldn't stay there. The cave felt like it was closing in, threatening to claim him. Ignoring the agony, he bolted, leaving behind his helmet, gear, and even the thoughts of his injuries. Sacco shoved a light into his hand, and Dawson barely acknowledged it. His mind was consumed by one thought: survival. He stumbled through the dark, his vision blurred and his body screaming in protest. He reached the narrow crawlway near the cave entrance, dropping his hands and knees. The crawlway was tight, every movement a battle against the sharp rocks and his failing body. His head spun, his vision blurred, and his heart pounded. Halfway through, his strength gave out. He collapsed, the world tilting around him. His weak and strained voice called out for help. Near the cave entrance, his wife Nancy heard his cries. She rushed to him, her hands grabbing the collar of his cave suit. Using every ounce of her strength, she dragged him forward while he feebly pushed with his feet. Each pull sent waves of pain crashing through his body. His broken ribs ground together, his breaths shallow and labored. Finally, they emerged from the crawlway into the larger passage leading to the cave's entrance. Dawson's body was on the verge of collapse. his mind teetering on the edge of unconsciousness. Outside, the fresh air hit him like a wave, but he couldn't enjoy it. Nancy sprinted to the car and called for help. By the time they reached the visitor center, an ambulance was waiting. Dawson was rushed to the hospital, where the full extent of his injuries was revealed. He had suffered a concussion, multiple broken ribs, internal bleeding, dislocated shoulder, and countless other injuries. The day that began with excitement nearly ended in tragedy. The cave had shown no mercy, its dark corridors and treacherous rocks turning a thrilling adventure into a nightmare. Dawson survived, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain forever. The land of the Swirling Mists Cave is no ordinary place. Its beauty hides its dangers, and its allure can quickly turn deadly. Dawson's escape was a testament to sheer willpower, but it was also a chilling reminder of the risks lurking in the darkness. Here are 3 stories that made my knees quake. Every time it gave me hope, it broke my heart even further. Again, viewers' discretion is advised, and if you are claustrophobic, you might want to skip this video. The first story goes thus. May 14th, 2022 began as a perfect spring day in Chiefland, Florida. The skies were clear, and the breeze cut through the usual warmth, making it an ideal day to explore Manatee Spring State Park. While the park is famous for the manatees that glide through its waters, it also hides a far more dangerous attraction below the surface. A vast underwater cave system once considered one of the longest in the world. Spanning thousands of interconnected caves and sinkholes, it draws thrill-seeking divers from far and wide. On this fateful day, 2 father and son diving teams arrived at the park. Though their names remain unknown, they will be called Billy, Mike, John, and Dave. All 4 were certified in introductory cave diving and had about 100 dives each under their belts. This gave them confidence, perhaps too much, to attempt a traverse dive through the cave system, a risky endeavor, even for seasoned experts. Their inspiration came from a YouTube video they had seen, where divers had successfully explored this very route, despite the obvious hazards. The thrill of it all was too tempting, and that single video was the only preparation they had. No maps, no first-hand advice, just fragments of memory. The dive plan was straightforward in theory. They would enter the caves through a narrow sinkhole called Friedman Sink, swim downstream, pass through a second sinkhole called Sioux Sink, and exit through Catfish Hotel, a larger, more popular sinkhole. The distance spanned over 1,700 feet of twisting, water-filled tunnels. Each diver brought 2 side-mounted air cylinders filled to 3,800 psi, along with backup lights. John and Dave also carried cameras mounted with bright floodlights to capture their adventure. At 11:15 a.m., the 4 entered Friedman Sink, descending into the dark unknown. Billy and Mike took the lead, with John and Dave following closely. The group relied on a permanent guideline, a thin rope fixed to the cave wall to navigate. This rope is a lifeline in emergencies, helping divers find their way when visibility drops or panic sets in. At first, the dive was mesmerizing. The beams of their lights illuminated walls carved by millennia of water flow, and every turn offered an exhilarating view. It was the thrill the YouTube video had promised, and perhaps even more. The trouble began as they approached Sioux Sink. Beyond this point, visibility worsened dramatically. A dark, cloudy mass of sediment hung in the water ahead, stirred up by unknown forces. Their lights struggled to penetrate the gloom, revealing nothing but swirling murk. Billy and Mike stopped, unsure if they were even on the right path. The guideline led straight into the impenetrable cloud, but it was impossible to tell where it ended. John and Dave arrived moments later, equally uncertain. The 4 hovered in the tunnel, the silence of the water amplifying the tension. Every second spent there increased the risk of disorientation, and with it, danger. Billy, in a bold but risky move, decided to swim a short distance into the sediment cloud to see if visibility improved. The moment he entered, the silt enveloped him, making everything around him vanish. Realizing the danger, he turned back immediately. Getting lost in the cloud could have been fatal. Back with the group, Billy pulled out an underwater slate to communicate. He scrawled a single word, manatee. A question mark followed. Did he think they had reached a manatee-filled section of the cave? Or was it a wild guess in the face of uncertainty? No one could be sure. Their air supplies were finite, their surroundings disorienting, and the path forward unclear. Time was running out. The shadows pressed in as the 4 divers hesitated, unsure if they should risk moving ahead or retreat. Beyond Catfish Hotel, the waters of Manatee Spring are off limits to divers. Billy believed they had accidentally bypassed Catfish Hotel and were in a tunnel leading to the restricted spring. Unbeknownst to them, they were just 10 to 15 feet from the exit point at Catfish Hotel. So close to safety, yet unaware of it, the group faced a tough choice. Either they would continue toward what they assumed was the forbidden spring, or turn back, hoping to find Catfish Hotel. This decision seemed simple but carried enormous consequences. They assumed backtracking to the last sinkhole would be straightforward, but but their dive had transformed from a traverse to an out-and-back dive. This type of dive demands meticulous air calculations, including turn pressure, the minimum air required to make it back against the current. Their situation had suddenly become much more dangerous. As John calculated the turn pressure, his heart sank. The numbers were tight. That was before they realized how strong the current was. Swimming against it was grueling, requiring more energy and causing their breathing rates to spike. The harder they fought the current, the faster their precious air drained. John felt the panic building as his breathing grew labored. Gripping the guideline with white-knuckled hands, he pulled himself forward, inch by inch, desperate to conserve air while making progress. The tunnel felt endless as the current pushed back at every moment. John's concern turned into dread as the effort burned through their air supply faster than anticipated. The upline for Sioux Sink came into view. Relief surged when he saw Billy ascending toward the surface. Turning back, he caught a glimpse of Mike and Dave struggling behind him. Flashing an OK signal, he received one in return, though the tension was palpable. Time was running out. Billy surfaced, gasping for air, and moments later, John emerged beside him. Both checked their tanks. Billy's had less than half remaining, and John's were critically low. They knew they had barely escaped, but their relief was muted. Mike and Dave were still below. The minutes stretched painfully as they waited. Each passing second felt like an eternity. Finally, John grabbed his phone and called for emergency help. Meanwhile, in the cave, Mike and Dave faced a devastating mistake. They missed the upline for Sioux Sink and instead swam toward their starting point at Friedman Sink. As Mike reached the uphill section of the tunnel, he turned back to check on his father. Dave's light glimmered faintly behind him, giving Mike some comfort, but their air was dwindling rapidly. When Mike reached the upline at Friedman Sink, he ascended immediately, confident his father was just behind him. Breaking the surface at 12:20 p.m., Mike checked his tanks and felt his stomach drop. One was completely empty, and the other was nearly drained. He waited, scanning the water for signs of his father. Minutes ticked by. His father never appeared. By now, Dave had been in the cave far longer than anyone else. Fear gripped Mike as he realized something had gone terribly wrong. Emergency divers arrived at 1 p.m., ready to search the deadly labyrinth below. Descending into the dark, they found Dave's camera first, its floodlight casting eerie shadows on the cave floor. Time was slipping away, and hope was fading fast. A specialized cave rescue team joined the search, sweeping through the tunnels with precision. Finally, they found Dave's lifeless body midway through the uphill section near Friedman Sink. His air tanks were completely empty. The sight was haunting. Every effort had been made, but the unforgiving cave had claimed another life. The investigation that followed uncovered a series of missteps and challenges that contributed to the tragedy. In the darkness of the Manatee Spring cave system, Dave had fought bravely, but had no air left to win the battle. The investigation made it clear their decision to attempt this dive sealed Dave's fate. The Manatee Springs cave system's powerful siphon current is a force few can handle. Combine that with a traverse-style dive, and even seasoned, fully certified divers would struggle. The group had no idea the current was this strong, nor did they understand how their starting point set them up to fail. Entering at Friedman Sink and swimming downstream meant turning back was a death sentence if air supplies ran low. Two crucial park rules should have stopped them. First, only fully certified cave divers are allowed in. Second, newcomers must dive with someone experienced in the system. The group had minimal training and based their entire plan on a YouTube video. They ignored safety, diving blind into a labyrinth that demanded respect and expertise. John made a fatal mistake when he surfaced at Sioux Sink and failed to wait for Mike and Dave. Lost without direction, they missed the upline. Mike's choice to ascend at Friedman Sink before ensuring his father's safety compounded the disaster. The report also criticized the creators of the YouTube video, calling their encouragement reckless. True cave divers prioritize safety, not thrills at the expense of lives. A year later, the cave claimed another victim. A seasoned, certified diver, accompanied by experts, was pinned by the current. It tore off his mask and breathing system, proving that even the best can fall to the merciless grip of Manatee Springs. At the very start of the story, you can feel a tingle creeping up your spine. Imagine standing at the edge of a world that most people wouldn't dare to enter, a world of tight passages, suffocating darkness, and unshakable silence. The second story is about a daring cave, Nutty Putty Cave, a place infamous for its unforgiving nature and tragic past. It's a location that has claimed lives, including the heart-wrenching case of John Jones, whose story echoes through every shadowy corner of this underground labyrinth. But this isn't his tale. This time, we dive into another set of harrowing stories that highlight just how treacherous this cave truly is. In 2009, John Jones entered Nutty Putty Cave, full of life and promise. A 26-year-old man with dreams of becoming a pediatrician, he was exploring with his brother during Thanksgiving. Crawling through the cave's unforgiving passages, he mistook a tight section known as the birth canal for another area. The birth canal earned its name because it squeezes you through like you're being reborn on the other side. John pressed forward into what he thought was this passage, only to find himself in a much worse trap. He ended up in a tight fissure, a near-vertical dead end, where gravity and the cave's merciless design worked against him. Try picturing it, pressed against cold rock, unable to turn or retreat, with only darkness around. John tried to push his way back up, but it was too late. His body, held upside down by the cave's grip, began to betray him. When you stay upside down for too long, your blood pools in your brain, and your heart struggles to keep up. Even a strong and healthy person can't endure this forever. After many desperate hours and a massive rescue effort, John's body gave out. The rescuers were devastated. There was nothing they could do but seal the cave with John's remains inside, forever closing the entrance to what had become a tomb. This story is not the first tragedy of Nutty Putty Cave, nor was it the last close call before the final closure. Before John, the cave had earned a sinister reputation, especially among inexperienced adventurers. It drew Boy Scouts, college students, and thrill-seekers alike, most unaware of the risks hiding in its depths. From 2000 to 2005 alone, there were 7 rescue missions. Each year, people would enter, thinking they could conquer its passages, and each year, rescuers were called to save lives. In 2004, a 16-year-old boy named Brock Clark got trapped in a fissure, possibly the same deadly crevice that would later take John's life. Brock was lucky. Rescuers managed to pull him out in time. 2 weeks after Brock's close call, another adventurer, David Crowther, became stuck for 8 grueling hours. His story also had a happy ending, but not everyone was so fortunate. In 2001, 2 Boy Scouts ventured deep into the cave and found themselves stranded in a tight, dangerous section, later nicknamed the Scout Eater. The name alone sends chills down your spine. Imagine being a child, lost and stuck in a world of darkness, with walls pressing in on all sides. Rescuers reached the boys in just 4 hours, but those hours likely felt like an eternity in such an environment. For emergency responders, Nutty Putty Cave became a nightmare to manage. It drained resources and tested the limits of both skill and endurance. Despite its popularity, many began to see the cave for what it truly was, a dangerous trap. After John's tragic end, officials had no choice but to seal it permanently. They poured concrete over the entrance, ensuring no one else could enter its dark, deadly corridors. But long before John's story, 2 adventurous teenagers, Chris Marr and Chris Hale, almost became the ones to close the cave forever. During their last summer before heading off to college, the pair, along with friends, decided to explore Nutty Putty. It was a warm, bright day in Salt Lake City, and they felt invincible. The cave, however, had other plans. They drove 70 miles south to the entrance, eager for an adventure. That eagerness would soon turn to fear as they ventured into its depths. Think about standing on the edge of an unknown abyss. Every step feels like the ground could give way. Every tight crawl feels like the walls might close in forever. These teens, full of excitement, were about to learn just how merciless the cave could be. The air was tense as the group set up their tents for the night, knowing that by morning, they'd face the dark and winding depths of Nutty Putty Cave. Sleep came easily to some, but for others, the thought of crawling into the unknown must have loomed in their minds. By 9 a.m. the next morning, their excitement overpowered any fear. The group entered the cave, eager to explore its infamous twists and tight passages. Not long into their journey, Chris Marr and Chris Hales decided to split off from the group. Their goal was the birth canal, a notorious part of the cave known for its tight squeeze. Lay about 12 feet underground, its name alone enough to make most adventurers pause. They crawled deeper and deeper, with Marr leading the way. The passages grew narrower with every inch, forcing them to wriggle on their stomachs and suck in their breaths to avoid getting stuck. Marr believed they had reached the birth canal and pushed forward, but something wasn't right. He didn't realize he had turned into the wrong tunnel. This new path sloped downward at a dangerous angle, forcing him to go headfirst on his stomach. The walls of the rock tightened around him as he pushed forward, his body scraping and twisting. Behind him, Hales followed, oblivious to the mistake they'd just made. The realization hit like a wave of cold terror. Marr saw with his flashlight that the path ahead was a dead end. There was no way out. He called back to Hales, his voice shaking as he told him the awful truth. They had crawled into a trap. Marr tried to reverse course, curling his body into a ball to turn around, but the walls gripped him like a vice. The harder he struggled, the tighter the rock seemed to hold him. Hales was also stuck, wedged into the narrow tunnel with no room to move. Their screams for help echoed through the cave. Time stretched unbearably long, but finally, their friends heard them. The group raced back to the surface to call for help. Within an hour, a team of 40 rescuers arrived, ready to face the cave's unforgiving grip. The rescue effort began in earnest, but progress was slow. From the surface, friends sent food and water down to Marr and Hales while they waited. Stuck in the cold, crushing darkness, the 2 boys tried to keep their spirits up. They joked, prayed, and reminded each other to stay calm. When fear began to creep in, they reassured one another. Above ground, hours passed with little sign of progress. Mar's mother was notified late in the afternoon, and panic set in as she raced to the scene. Her mind played back to when she had said goodbye to her son the day before. Rescuers finally devised a plan. The only way to free the boys was to pull them out by their feet using ropes. A member of the team carefully slid down to Hales, tying the rope around his ankles. The rescuers braced themselves and began to pull while Hales wriggled and twisted to free himself. The sharp rocks dug into his body, but he kept going, driven by the thought of escaping. After 12 agonizing hours, Hales was pulled free at 10:30 p.m. Mar's rescue took even longer. Hours of effort followed as the team worked carefully to avoid making the situation worse. Finally, after what must have felt like a lifetime, Mar emerged from the tunnel. The two friends hugged tightly, relief washing over them. Their bodies bore only minor scrapes and bruises, but the emotional weight of the experience was far heavier. Mar later admitted he repeated to himself that he wasn't claustrophobic to keep calm in the cave. Strangely, the harrowing ordeal didn't scare him away entirely. Before Nutty Putty was sealed in 2009, Mar returned twice more to explore its depths, even revisiting the very spot where he had been trapped. He walked away unscathed on those visits, but many others were not so lucky. This third story is about Poland's deepest and largest cave. Śnieżna Cave sits ominously in the Tatra Mountains, a natural border between Poland and Slovakia. Known as the Great Snowy Cave, it sprawls across 5 separate entrances, each at different elevations. Discovered in 1959, explorers have spent decades mapping its massive limestone passages. Despite their efforts, its treacherous depths remain largely uncharted, with only 273 feet reached after more than 6 decades of perilous expeditions. On August 15, 2019, 6 experienced cavers from the Viave Caving Club set out to explore a connection between Śnieżna Cave and a deeper section called Semilot, almost 2,000 feet below the highest entrance. The journey required days of travel and careful planning. The group entered the cave at 8 p.m. and set up their first camp deep within its labyrinthine corridors. The following evening, 2 members, Daniel and Josek, headed towards Semilot, while the others explored a different section. Semilot is a nightmare of tight, winding passages, and the group split to make navigation easier. But as Daniel and Josek squeezed through one of the claustrophobic tunnels, disaster struck. Heavy rains had drenched the Tatra Mountains for days, and the water finally surged into the cave, flooding their only route back. They turned to retreat, only to find the passage submerged and impassable. Trapped and cut off, the air grew heavy with fear as the water level crept higher. Back at camp, their companions waited anxiously. When Daniel and Josek failed to return, the group launched a frantic search. They shouted into the dark void, and were relieved to hear faint replies. The trapped men confirmed the grim reality. They were surrounded by rising water, unable to move. Every inch of the tunnel now posed a deadly challenge, and holding their breath long enough to navigate even a few feet was impossible. By 2 a.m. on August 17th, the others realized they had no choice but to leave the cave and get help. It was a desperate, exhausting climb back to the surface, taking twice as long as their descent. After 12 grueling hours, they reached an area with cell reception and contacted the Tatra Mountain Rescue Team, known as Topper. Time was slipping away. Topper acted quickly, sending their first rescuers to the cave within hours. Reaching the nearest entrance required a helicopter, and navigating the tunnels demanded precision. Śnieżna Cave's tight spaces limited how many rescuers could attempt the perilous descent. By the time the first team entered at 8 p.m., 48 hours had passed since Daniel and Josek were trapped. At 3 a.m., after a full day of careful progress, the rescue team reached the flooded section. The scene was dire. 2 possible routes lay before them. One was the original path Daniel and Josek had taken, now entirely underwater. The other was a passage always flooded, but even more treacherous. Diving through this second route was deemed too dangerous, leaving the team with one agonizing option: widen the submerged tunnel using explosives. This plan, however, would take precious time. Rescuers worked tirelessly, aware that every second mattered. The water continued to rise, inching closer to the trapped men. Daniel and Josek, meanwhile, clung to hope in the suffocating dark, knowing their survival depended on the rescue team's speed and precision. The cave seemed almost alive, its stone walls pressing in tighter with each hour. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional trickle of water or the distant echoes of the rescue effort. As the team prepared to blast through the rock, the immense danger of their task loomed over them. Would they reach the men in time, Could they overcome the cave's relentless grip? The rescue effort in the depths of Sneezna Cave seemed to be slipping further into hopelessness with each passing hour. When rescuers tried to make voice contact after reaching the flood, they were met with silence. That silence was more terrifying than any sound they could have imagined. The conditions beyond the flooded passage were unknown, and the lack of response only deepened the fear. The two men, Daniel and Jozek, were likely trapped in freezing cold water. At their depth, the air would have been thick with carbon monoxide, making every breath a struggle. It was already clear to the rescue team by that evening that the men were likely in severe hypothermia, and the rescuers were still no closer to finding them. Each time the rescue team blasted the rock to widen the tunnel, they were forced to wait outside for hours for the dust and smoke to clear. The dangerous gases inside made it unsafe for the rescuers to work in those conditions. Meanwhile, Daniel and Jozek were struggling for their lives, their chances of survival dwindling. By August 19th, the chief of the rescue team addressed the media and declared that their chances of survival were extremely slim. Despite this, the rescue effort continued, but progress slowed to a crawl. The team had no way of venting the bad air faster, and every inch of tunnel cleared seemed to take hours. On August 20th, the rescuers tried to improve the situation by constructing a ventilation system. Unfortunately, it had minimal effect. They had widened the tunnel to 16 feet, but the rock debris was still blocking the way. It was slow and grueling work. The team even considered attempting to reach the men through another passage, one that was always flooded, but another assessment confirmed that this route was too risky. Then, at 4 p.m. that afternoon, the first major breakthrough came. The lead rescuers found Daniel and Jozek's equipment. 2 harnesses, some food, and a damaged drill. That gave the team a sliver of hope. But later that night, a sound from the rock walls sent chills through the team. One of the men was snoring, but it wasn't a regular snore. It was a gurgling, labored snore that confirmed the men were still alive, but barely. It was the unmistakable sound of someone nearing the edge of death. The snoring meant they were on the brink of hypothermia and needed medical attention urgently. As the hours passed, the rescuers faced new obstacles. Unauthorized locals had snuck into the cave to get a closer look at the operation, forcing the rescue team to stop and redirect resources to chase them out. These intruders had entered through one of the other cave entrances, and now the rescue team had to guard these ways in as well. Another 12 hours passed before they could get back to work. By the morning of August 21st, things were looking bleak. The ceiling above the weakened tunnel had collapsed from the blasting, trapping the rescuers and destroying much of the equipment. The ropes were snapped, and the ventilation system was gone. The entrance to the section where the men were believed to be was now completely blocked. The team had no choice but to clear the fallen rocks and start the process all over again. By 10 p.m. that night, the team finally made visual contact with one of the men. He wasn't moving or responding, and it was clear that he was dead. The rescuers couldn't even reach him, but they knew it was only a matter of time before they would find the other man. The next morning, the rescue effort turned into a recovery mission. Both men were believed to be dead, and the scene inside the cave painted a grim picture. The body of one of the cavers was found wedged inside a narrow pipe, which led the rescuers to believe the men had gotten stuck while trying to rescue themselves. It was also suggested that the men had obstructed the water flow, causing it to accumulate and eventually drown them. Vav Caving Club objected to the assumption that both men were dead and appealed to the Polish Prime Minister to force the rescue team to continue, but the decision stood. On August 24th, the first sign of the second man appeared. A piece of cloth was found in the tunnel, and the hope of recovery continued. However, the second body wouldn't be retrieved until September 5th. An autopsy later confirmed that both men had died from hypothermia, not drowning. Neither outcome was desirable, but it was the cruel reality of the cave's unforgiving depths. On September 17th, a month after the men were first reported trapped, the last of the equipment used in the rescue operation was removed from the cave. The cave had claimed 2 more lives, and the haunting silence that followed spoke volumes about the danger that lurked beneath the earth. Fear is real, but when faced with death, fear is a whole different ballgame. This caver went down with thrill, but in the long run, the walls turned against him, and the seconds became daring. As he could feel his own blood pump into his head, he could also feel his breath being pulled away. This is a story of a caver that caught the attention of many. The story begins with the Nutty Putty Cave, a treacherous and infamous site west of Utah Lake, about 55 miles from Salt Lake City. This cave, known for its labyrinth-like design, was the setting of a horrifying tragedy in 2009. 26-year-old John Edward Jones, exploring the cave with family and friends, mistakenly ventured into an unmapped section. His luck ran out. he got stuck upside down in a narrow place. Despite a desperate rescue effort involving 137 volunteers over 27 hours, stick around to find out if he made it out alive. The Nutty Putty Cave is notorious for more than John's tragic fate. In 1999, two teenagers, both 17 years old, got wedged in a tight passage ominously called the birth canal. Rescuers needed 40 volunteers and nearly 12 hours to free them. In 2004, another heart-pumping case occurred when 16-year-old Brock Clark, trapped upside down in a tight section just past the corkscrew, had to wait 14 agonizing hours before he was saved. These events paint a chilling picture of the cave's danger, which has repeatedly tested the limits of human endurance. To understand the full horror of John's predicament, it helps to grasp the deadly design of the Nutty Putty Cave. It's a hypogenic cave, meaning it was carved out by superheated water rising from beneath the Earth's surface. This natural chaos is why adventurers loved it, but also why many became victims of its treachery. The Nutty Putty Cave extends approximately 1,400 feet underground, with its deepest point plunging 145 feet below the surface. From the entrance, explorers face two choices. Go right to areas like the Big Slide, Birth Canal, and Aorta Crawl, or head left to navigate the Maze, Big Room, and the Crack. Neither path guarantees safety. Warning signs littered the cave, highlighting the extreme challenges ahead in sections like the Birth Canal and Scout Eater. John's ordeal began when he slid into an unexplored shaft, unable to climb back out. Trapped upside down, his situation turned grim quickly. John's body endured unimaginable strain in his final hours. Being upside down for such an extended period placed immense pressure on his heart and lungs. Rescuers worked tirelessly, but the narrow passage left little room for tools or maneuvering. Each failed attempt brought mounting despair. The cave's name, Nutty Putty, adds a strange irony to its dark reputation. Coined by Dale Green, who discovered it in 1960, the name was inspired by Silly Putty, the toy that's both pliable and unpredictable. Green, the man who named the cave, originally thought the clay inside felt like a silly putty, but the name didn't sound right, so he called it Nutty Putty instead. The horrifying story of John Edward Jones begins here, deep within its treacherous tunnels. John entered the cave with his brother Josh and 9 others, including family and friends, during Thanksgiving in 2009. Both John and Josh were experienced cavers, though they hadn't explored caves together in years. The group split early on. Less experienced members went to easier sections while John and others sought tougher challenges. Within the first hour, John and Josh navigated a large area known as the Big Slide. John then suggested trying the Birth Canal, a notoriously tight and challenging section. Unfortunately, what they thought was the entrance to the Birth Canal turned out to be an unmapped part of the cave. John led the way, squeezing into a narrow passage. At first, he believed it would eventually open into a larger space where he could turn around. He pushed on, crawling through 15 feet of tight tunnel, then another 10 feet with jagged rocks jutting out. Eventually, he reached a section known as the corkscrew. This part was notorious, requiring skill and a small body to navigate. John, however, was 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds, far from the ideal size for such a squeeze. He managed to force himself through, driven by the hope that the passage would open up. Beyond the corkscrew, John found an incline. Other cavers had turned back at this point, knowing how dangerous it was. A 16-year-old boy had been stuck here in 2004 and barely escaped after 14 hours of rescue efforts. But John didn't stop. He climbed the incline, reached a sharp bend to the left, and faced a steep slope. Thinking he saw a wider opening ahead, he pushed onward. Then, everything went wrong. The space grew even narrower, but John kept going. Suddenly, he realized he was trapped. John pressed on a little more, hoping to find a way to turn around. Instead, he slid down into a hole only 18 inches by 10 inches wide. He became wedged upside down at a terrifying 70-degree angle. The opening he thought he saw was nothing but an illusion. Hours turned into a nightmare. For the first 5 hours, John's body was in a state of high adrenaline. His heart pounded, his blood pressure surged, and his muscles tensed as his body prepared for survival. Blood began pooling in John's head and chest, straining his heart and lungs. Rescue efforts began, involving over 100 volunteers. They worked tirelessly, attempting to free John from the deadly grip of the cave. However, the narrow passage made it nearly impossible to maneuver tools or equipment. Each attempt brought more despair as time slipped away. The Nutty Putty cave is infamous for these kinds of traps. Its passages are tight, winding, and unpredictable. The conditions inside are harsh, with sticky clay and slippery surfaces making every move dangerous. The air grows thin in deeper sections, adding to the danger. Adventurers like John entered seeking challenge and thrill, but for some, the cave became their tomb. John's story is one of bravery, desperation, and the unrelenting cruelty of nature. He fought hard, but the cave gave no mercy. As the hours passed, the toll on his body became unbearable. Rescue teams did everything they could, but the odds were against them. After 27 hours of being trapped, John's body gave out. Adrenaline surged through John's body when he got stuck, a natural response to danger. It pushed his cardiovascular system to its limits for a few minutes, giving him a sudden boost of strength. His heart raced, blood pressure spiked, and energy flooded his muscles. This rush might have helped him wiggle slightly from the crevice, but adrenaline is short-lived. After a few minutes, his body would have experienced a sharp drop in energy, leaving him weaker than before. John was already exhausted when he got trapped. Earlier, he and his brother Josh had spent about an hour navigating the big slide section of Nutty Putty Cave. The twisting, turning, crawling, and climbing had drained him. The 35-foot shaft he ventured into next demanded even more energy. By the time he reached the steep decline where he got stuck, his arms were likely burning from holding his weight. The decline added pressure on his body, and the tight space left him with little room to maneuver. When John hit the bottom of the shaft, the real nightmare began. One arm was pinned under his chest, and the other was trapped against a rock. He tried desperately to wedge himself free, using every ounce of strength he had left. Then, Josh crawled back into the shaft, feet first, and tried to pull John out. But the space was too tight, and John's body wouldn't budge. Both brothers ended up exhausted and frustrated, realizing they couldn't solve this alone. Hanging upside down in such a confined space put John's body under immense strain. The human body isn't designed to be inverted for more than a few seconds at a time. For John, the effects of being upside down began almost immediately. Every second added to his suffering. The crushing pressure on his chest made it hard to breathe. His vision may have blurred as blood built up behind his eyes. His heart would have been pumping furiously, trying to protect his brain from hemorrhaging while also battling the toxins building up in his blood. Doug Murdoch, a physician involved in the rescue effort, knew the situation was grim. He understood what John's body was enduring. Murdoch estimated that John had only a few hours before his body would give out completely. The psychological toll on John must have been just as severe. After Josh's failed attempt to free him, he crawled out of the cave to get help. The group had entered the cave at around 8 p.m., and by the time Josh made the distress call, it was roughly 9 p.m. Rescue teams quickly mobilized, but the situation was dire. Nutty Putty Cave's narrow passages made it nearly impossible to bring in tools or equipment. Rescuers faced an uphill battle, both physically and logistically. John's heart endured unimaginable stress during this time. After the initial adrenaline rush, his body shifted into survival mode. His heart pumped at an unnatural rate for hours, trying to counteract gravity's pull. This constant strain likely kept him in a state of hyperarousal, his body working overtime just to stay alive. As time passed, John's condition worsened. Blood pressure in his head increased, his heart rate slowed, and his organs began to fail. John had been trapped for almost 4 hours before she arrived. That's 4 hours of being wedged headfirst in a tight, dark crevice. Josh later described the sight as if John had been swallowed by the rock itself. Air was another critical issue. Being stuck in such a position, John's lungs would have struggled to work properly. Hours passed, and as his lungs weakened, they likely began filling with fluid. His brain would have been sending out relentless distress signals, amplifying his fear and anxiety. Science tells us that after 2 hours without food, the body begins craving more energy. For John, this hunger was worsened by the sheer physical exertion of crawling, squeezing, and pulling through the cave before he got stuck. Every movement had burned calories he couldn't replace. Stress compounded the problem. The human body releases cortisol in stressful situations, a hormone that triggers cravings for high sugar and high fat foods. This is the body's way of trying to maintain balance during a crisis. But for John, stuck in the cold rock with no food in sight, cortisol's effects were just another cruel reminder of his helplessness. The rescue crew outside had already started strategizing. They designed an intricate pulley system, hoping it could pull John free. One end of the pulley was attached to John's feet, while rescuers on the other end would use their combined strength to try and pull him out. Imagine the scene. Deep in the cave, surrounded by rock and darkness, John was trapped at a 7-degree angle, his body struggling to function. Outside, rescuers worked tirelessly, their hope clashing against the overwhelming odds. John's position wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Every second, his lungs fought harder for air, his blood turned more toxic, and his heart struggled to keep up. The rescue crew knew they were racing against time. They had to act quickly, but every attempt to free John came with risks. John's situation highlights the terror of being utterly helpless, in a place where the environment itself becomes the enemy. The rock, the darkness, the lack of air, they all worked together, tightening their grip on him. It was a battle against forces far beyond human control, and the stakes were life and death. The rescuers set up a pulley system in the narrow cave, determined to move John's 200-pound body even an inch. They anchored ropes and installed climbing cams in the shaft. But the task was overwhelming. The shaft was so tight, it only allowed one person at a time. Moving supplies or equipment in and out took nearly an hour for each trip. They tried using drilling equipment to free John, but the cramped space made it almost impossible. The smaller drills they could fit inside barely worked, and after 90 minutes of exhausting effort, they had only managed to chip away 6 inches of rock. The cave's ceiling was made of calcite, a material that refused to cooperate. Every time they anchored the pulley, it popped loose with even the slightest pull. Around 2:30 a.m., Susie left the cave, her attempts to free John unsuccessful. Ryan, another rescuer, crawled in to take her place. John wasn't alone during these changes, but the situation was getting worse. Ryan found John disoriented. When he asked John why he was stuck on his head, John responded with confusion, almost as if he believed someone else had put him there. That moment revealed just how badly John's condition had deteriorated. The lack of oxygen was taking its toll. His brain, starved of fresh air, was slipping into hypoxia, a condition where the brain cannot function properly due to insufficient oxygen. Ryan witnessed John swinging between calm conversations and sudden panicked thrashing. It was as if John was fighting a losing battle against his body's survival instincts. Medical experts would call this delirium. The rescue team gave him Gatorade through a straw, providing small bursts of energy and restoring his body's ionic balance. It wasn't much, but it helped. John spoke about Emily, his wife, their 1-year-old daughter Virginia, and the unborn child he hadn't yet met. At one point, he even spoke with Emily over a telecom. Hearing her voice must have been a flicker of light in the suffocating darkness, lifting his spirits just enough to keep him going. 9 hours had passed since John first became trapped, and the rescuers were no closer to freeing him. The pulley system was ready, but nothing about the situation had gotten easier. The cams on the calcite ceiling continued to fail under the strain, and John's position presented yet another challenge. His feet were pinned in such a way that they couldn't bend upward. The narrow cave wouldn't allow his legs to straighten, and the rescuers faced an unthinkable decision, breaking his knees to pull him out. Adding to the horror, John was in unbearable pain. His body had been hanging upside down for hours, blood pooling in his head and toxins building in his system. His organs were under immense pressure, his breathing shallow and labored. The rescuers worked tirelessly, but the cave seemed determined to hold on to John. The rock pressed down like an unyielding monster, and every attempt to free him only revealed more challenges. The narrow, claustrophobic tunnel, the unrelenting rock, and the weight of gravity turned the cave into a silent predator, and John was its prey. As the hours dragged on, the team clung to hope, but the grim reality loomed over them. Would the cave let him go, or would it claim him forever? The situation inside the cave had become dire. John's agony was evident when he told a rescuer that his legs were killing him. The rescuers pressed on, determined to free him despite the unbearable conditions. 8 men worked the pulley system while Ryan stayed close to monitor every movement. Slowly, John began to rise, inching upward until his feet touched the rock above the crevice. But then, he let out a scream. The pain was overwhelming. His red, tear-filled eyes showed how much he was suffering. After a short rest, they tried again. This time, disaster struck. As they pulled, the rope gave way. The cam at the top of the crevice snapped loose, and chaos followed. The pulley lashed back violently, striking Ryan in the face. He collapsed immediately, knocked unconscious with a broken jaw and swollen eyes. John, on the other hand, slid right back into the narrow crevice. He landed on his head, deeper than before. Despite everything, John did not seem visibly worse after the fall, but his body was far from okay. The strain had been building for hours. The prolonged stress, lack of oxygen, and upside-down position were taking their toll. His organs were shutting down, one by one. When Ryan was pulled out of the cave, his father, Dave, a cave expert, crawled in to check on John. For a moment, John seemed coherent enough to ask about Ryan's injuries. But then, he fell silent, unresponsive. Dave checked for a heartbeat and found one. It was faint, a flicker of life in a body overwhelmed by trauma. The fall had likely triggered an adrenaline surge, but John's heart was too weak to sustain him. Hanging upside down for so long had drained his strength. Blood couldn't circulate properly, and his heart struggled against the mounting strain. Low oxygen, crushing darkness, relentless panic, and total exhaustion compounded his suffering. Delirium had already clouded his mind. It was only a matter of time. Not long after, John's body shut down completely. Brandon, another rescuer, entered the cave to check on him, but there was no response. A paramedic followed to confirm what everyone feared. John had died. His heart had given out, unable to withstand the relentless pressure and stress. Cardiac arrest was the official cause of death. The tragedy left the rescue team and John's family devastated. In the wake of his death, the Nutty Putty cave was permanently sealed. The entrance to the crevice where John became trapped was blasted with dynamite, and concrete was poured over the main cave entrance to ensure no one could ever enter again. John's body was never recovered. He remains inside the cave, entombed where he spent his final hours. A memorial plaque now marks the entrance, a solemn tribute to John's life, and a stark reminder of the dangers of cave exploration. In his final moments, John seemed to accept his fate. He reportedly told Dave that he knew he wasn't coming out alive. The weight of those words lingers, a haunting echo of the fear and pain he endured. The Nutty Putty cave, once a site of adventure and exploration, became a silent tomb, forever closed off from the world above. The events of that day remain a chilling testament to the unforgiving nature of the underground world. I won't be shocked if the Nutty Putty cave is opened one day in the future and explored, but I hope to God that when I'll report it, it will be of a good cause, not a grim outcome. Be careful what you look for and be careful what you wish for. You see this guy? He went cave searching. When he found what he was looking for, like Avatar Roku from Avatar: The Last Airbender, he vanished. In June 2014, a mysterious comment on YouTube set off a chain of events that has puzzled many to this day. The comment, posted by a user named SnakeBitMcGee, described an unusual experience in a cave near the Mojave Desert. The cave was shaped like a giant letter M and was located near Nellis Air Force Base in Area 51. According to McGee, as he entered the cave, his body began to vibrate intensely, an experience so strange that he fled in fear. Little did he know, this comment would spark widespread curiosity and change his life forever. Snakebit McGee's real identity was Kenny Leaf, a 47-year-old hiker with a passion for exploring remote locations. He had an impressive hiking record across Nevada and California, often venturing solo into the wild. Kenny also posted occasional videos on his own YouTube channel where he shared his outdoor adventures. His comment about the cave caught the attention of many online, with people intrigued by the mysterious cave he described. They were especially curious about the strange vibration he claimed to have felt. Kenny's online persona quickly gained attention as people became fascinated with his adventurous spirit and bold claims. He often boasted about his solo hikes, stating that he had been doing this for over 20 years. He described scaling mountain peaks, navigating dangerous cliffs, and surviving tough conditions. He even told a story about being rescued by helicopter after injuring his leg while hiking. Despite his many wild stories, some viewers were skeptical and demanded proof of his extraordinary feats. The story of the M Cave sparked even more curiosity when Kenny promised to return to the cave and document his experience. He wrote that he would bring a camera and a 9mm pistol for protection, as the terrain was difficult and dangerous. People online egged him on, urging him to go back and film what he found. Finally, in October 2014, Kenny set out to fulfill his promise, determined to find the mysterious cave once more. On his hike, Kenny filmed his journey and shared updates with his followers. He described the challenging 10-hour hike through the mountains north of Las Vegas, heading towards the cave he had discovered earlier. He explained that the cave was located in a narrow crevice, and he had been spooked the first time he encountered it. He felt the strange vibration the closer he got to the cave, which made him decide to leave without exploring further. This time, however, he was determined to go back and see what lay inside. As Kenny ventured closer to the M Cave, he described the landscape around him. The cave itself, shaped like a large M, stood on the side of a mountain, looking just as he remembered. He was excited to explore it further, but also cautious. His earlier fear lingered in his mind. With his camera in hand and a gun for protection, Kenny made his way toward the entrance of the cave, hoping to uncover whatever secret it might hold. However, despite his efforts, Kenny's journey took an unexpected turn. After making his way through the narrow crevice and reaching the cave, he vanished without a trace. His last video, which was posted on YouTube, was the last anyone heard from him. Since then, the mystery of Kenny's disappearance has only deepened. Some believe he was caught up in something far bigger than he ever imagined, while others think he simply got lost in the wild. Kenny V's story is one full of mystery, adventure, and unanswered questions. It all began in 2014 when Kenny, an avid hiker, shared a comment on YouTube about a mysterious cave he'd discovered. This cave, which he called the M Cave because of its M shape, was located in the Mojave Desert, not far from Area 51. Kenny described an eerie feeling when he approached the cave. His whole body vibrated, and it made him feel uneasy, enough to turn around and leave. Despite being an experienced hiker and spelunker, Kenny had never felt such fear before. This odd experience caught the attention of many online, especially those into hiking and conspiracy theories. They were intrigued by the idea of a hidden cave near the infamous Area 51, with some believing it might be a secret military base entrance. Others thought it was just an ordinary cave, but Kenny's description of the strange vibrations made many curious. Kenny was no stranger to hiking alone. He often boasted about his adventurous life, tackling tough terrain and mountains. His solo expeditions were the stuff of legend, and his online followers loved hearing about them. However, the M Cave was different. Despite his many daring hikes, he couldn't shake the strange feeling it gave him. This only added to the cave's mystery and sparked even more interest online. Soon after his comment about the M Cave, Kenny promised to return and film his next visit. He wanted to prove it wasn't just a tall tale. Many doubted him, accusing him of exaggerating or making up stories for attention. But Kenny, being the determined adventurer he was, wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He made plans to return to the cave, this time armed with a video camera and a firearm for safety. He promised his followers an exciting video, but his journey didn't go as planned. When Kenny went back to the Mojave Desert in October 2014, he set off on a 10-hour hike to find the M Cave. He filmed part of his journey, describing the terrain and the challenges he faced. Unfortunately, after hours of hiking, he couldn't find the cave. Frustrated but undeterred, he returned home and posted a video online admitting his failure. He promised to keep searching until he found the M Cave again, and he even dared his critics to join him on the hike. But no one took him up on the challenge. As Kenny planned his next hike, he made a comment about wanting to spend 3 days hiking and covering 40 miles to find the cave. But soon, something strange happened. Kenny vanished. In early November 2014, he went on another solo hike, this time without a camera to slow him down. He planned to camp for 2 days in the mountains near his home, but after that, no one heard from him. His family didn't get any messages, and his ex-girlfriend became concerned. When she checked his Facebook page, she saw messages from friends saying he was missing. His disappearance was reported on November 17th. His former sister-in-law, Susan, told a reporter that she was shocked by the news. She had just wished Kenny a happy birthday the day before and expected a reply, but that never came. As the days passed, more and more people started worrying. His family didn't know what to think. Some feared he had been reckless and hurt himself while hiking, possibly getting trapped somewhere in the desert. Rescue teams were sent out, and on November 22nd, they found Kenny's truck, and then something that made everyone even more confused: his cell phone. It was found near an old mine that was featured in one of Kenny's earlier videos. The phone was lying next to mine, but it was unclear whether Kenny dropped it or if he had intentionally left it there. It was a strange clue, and many people began speculating about what happened to him. Was it an accident or something more sinister? Kenny's daughter Vicky was also contacted. She immediately became suspicious when she heard about the phone being found by the mine. In Nevada, people often talked about how bodies could be hidden in abandoned mines, never to be found. She couldn't believe that her dad would just leave his phone behind like that. Something about it didn't seem right, and she feared that this might be part of a bigger mystery. After Kenny went missing, the trail went cold after that. But years later, a comment from his ex-girlfriend, Sharon, stirred up a whole new theory about what happened to him. She claimed that the commander of the search and rescue team told her that their search ended when the tracks reached the mine and there was nowhere else to go. It was a puzzling end to the search, especially since Kenny had been missing for so long. One thing that seemed strange was when Kenny was reported missing. Sharon didn't contact the authorities until November 17th, a full week after he had gone missing. That delay made people question the timing of the search. The police report said that the search didn't begin until 12 days after Kenny's hike. At that point, it was too late. Search teams only found his cell phone next to mine, and by then, they were no longer searching actively. A human can only survive in the desert for so long without water, so people were left wondering if this was a case of pure bad luck. Many theories surfaced about Kenny's disappearance. Some believed he stumbled upon a hidden tunnel connected to Area 51 and was somehow silenced. Kenny had always shown interest in UFOs and extraterrestrial life, often interacting with people online who believed in aliens. His connection to the mysterious M Cave, which he claimed to have found near Area 51, made the whole thing seem even stranger. But this theory was just that, a theory. Other, more practical ideas suggested that Kenny simply succumbed to the desert elements or maybe fell into a mining shaft. A few people who had been following the case suggested that the phone was left deliberately by Kenny. The phone was found near a landmark, the old mine, and it seemed like it was meant to be found. If Kenny wanted to keep his phone hidden, he would have tossed it somewhere out in the desert, far from the mine. But that didn't happen. The idea was that Kenny might have wanted people to believe he had fallen into the mine. Search teams even dropped a camera into the mine shaft, but there was nothing there. Still, the phone being found there added an eerie twist to the whole mystery. As time passed, people started to question Kenny's risky behavior. He was always pushing himself to do more, sometimes without proper preparation. He had even gotten injured before, and in his last video, he tripped during a hike. His reckless nature in the desert made some people think he had simply taken one step too many and met an unfortunate fate. One comment from a YouTube user, a retired archaeologist: pointed out that the desert is full of dangerous old mining shafts. People, including hikers and dirt bikers, had fallen into them before, so it wasn't out of the question that Kenny could have made a simple mistake and fallen into one of these deep holes. This seemed like a plausible explanation to many, but the mystery didn't die there. A bombshell comment appeared on YouTube from Sharon Pilgrim, who revealed herself as Kenny's girlfriend. At first, people weren't sure if she was telling the truth, but as more details came to light, it became clear she was. Sharon shared how she and Kenny used to go on daring hikes together, but she also offered a different perspective on his disappearance. She didn't think it was an accident at all. Instead, she believed Kenny had planned to disappear. Sharon explained that Kenny had been struggling with depression for a long time and had refused to take medication or see a doctor. A year before he disappeared, he had even quit his job. Sharon thought Kenny had gone into the desert with the intention of not returning. This new theory added another layer of complexity to the case. It was no longer just about a missing person. It was about someone who may have made a choice to vanish. Sharon's insight into Kenny's state of mind painted a picture of someone who had given up on life and didn't want to be found. It wasn't a tragic accident, but a decision driven by personal struggles. The search for Kenny was intense. A team of rescuers scoured the desert on foot while a helicopter flew overhead, but no sign of Kenny or his belongings was found. They did, however, find a cell phone near an old mine. This raised suspicions. Kenny left the phone behind on purpose, maybe to prevent anyone from tracking him through its GPS. His video camera, which he usually used for his adventures, was left at home, which made it clear he didn't plan on filming anything during this solo hike. One thing that stood out during the investigation was the cell phone found at the mine. Sharon, Kenny's girlfriend, mentioned something troubling. When Kenny was reported missing, the police found a computer in his house with the words, "Help me," written all over it. But nobody bothered to investigate his tech devices further, like his camera or laptop. They didn't check for any signs of a struggle or investigate his online activity. That seemed like a huge mistake. Sharon even suggested they could have found some clues if they had done a more thorough job. Sharon also recalled a conversation with Kenny a few weeks before his disappearance. He had told her that he was struggling with thoughts of ending his life, and that he planned to do it in the mountains where no one would find him. After that conversation, Sharon asked Kenny to check in with her every 5 days. If she didn't hear from him, she promised to call the police. Kenny was supposed to text her after 4 days, but when she didn't get a message, she contacted the authorities. That was the start of the search, even though Kenny had been missing for a whole week by then. Sharon wasn't the only one who remembered Kenny talking about disappearing. He told his brother Michael that if he ever decided to vanish, no one would find him. But Susan, who knew Kenny well, didn't believe that. Kenny had always been the positive, encouraging type. He was always there to lift people up when they were feeling down, and he had a way of turning bad situations into something hopeful. When his father passed away, Kenny had even spoken about it with Susan. The idea that he would just leave everything behind didn't seem to fit with the person he was. Internet detectives, also known as sleuths, started digging into Kenny's past to understand what might have led to his disappearance. They uncovered that Kenny's life had recently hit a rough patch. He had quit his job of 20 years, cashed out his retirement, and tried to start fresh as an inventor at the age of 47. He posted videos of his quirky inventions on YouTube, like a new kind of toilet paper holder. Despite his enthusiasm and creativity, none of his ideas ever made any money. His projects were commercial failures, and this left him in financial trouble. In fact, Kenny was so strapped for cash that he sold his house. He even made a YouTube video about it, calling it "Handsome Cowboy Sells Himself with His Home." He joked about how anyone buying the house would also get him as a caretaker. Despite his upbeat attitude, it was clear that Kenny was struggling. His inventions, his finances, and his life were all falling apart, and that left many wondering if it had all become too much for him. Kenny had a big dream. He wanted to sell his house, but still lived on the property as a caretaker. He wasn't just working for big companies anymore. He wanted to do things his way. Kenny had worked hard all his life, saving money and buying his dream house, but he wasn't ready to settle for the regular 9-to-5 grind. He had bigger plans. He wanted to create beautiful homes and sell them. However, he wasn't sure if those plans would work out. But not everyone agreed on why Kenny disappeared. Some people believed he was in debt and couldn't afford his house payments, leading him to make a tragic decision. But Susan, Kenny's friend, didn't buy that theory. She did some digging and contacted the Clark County Reporter's office. She found out that there were no liens on his property, and he didn't owe any money on it. He had even turned in a job application to a solar field company just a week before he left. So, according to Susan, there was no reason for Kenny to just walk away from everything, especially not his house. As the mystery of Kenny's disappearance grew, many online users started sharing their own theories. One Reddit user questioned if Kenny had really taken his own life. They believed it didn't make sense, especially since Kenny was always so upbeat and didn't want to hurt his family. As the internet buzzed with theories, Kenny's family also joined in on the conversation. A user who claimed to be Kenny's nephew posted a message remembering his uncle. He described Kenny as one of the best people to be around. He worked hard for everything he had and disappeared while doing what he loved. One thing that kept popping up during the search was the mysterious M Cave. This cave became a legend in its own right. The Red Rock search team even mentioned it as part of their search, but they never found it. Over the years, many hikers have set out to search for clues about what happened to Kenny or to find the elusive M Cave. Some have claimed to have found it, but no one has ever proven they discovered the real cave that Kenny had described. It's said to be shaped like a giant M, and it's located on the side of a mountain. Despite many claims, the cave remains a mystery, and the search continues. Some amateur investigators have become obsessed with finding it, but instead of answers, their efforts seem to just add to the pile of questions. Kenny had always said that he went into the cave and felt a strange vibration that scared him so much he ran away. He even planned to go back and get a gun, but Susan has her doubts about this story. She knows Kenny well, and points out that he always carried his camera with him on hikes. If he had really been scared by the cave, why didn't he take a picture or record a video of it? He dreamed of selling beautiful homes and making money doing what he loved, creating and inventing. However, not everything went according to plan. Some people believed Kenny's dreams had fallen apart. There were rumors about money problems. People said Kenny was struggling with his mortgage payments and couldn't keep up with his bills. The stress, they thought, might have pushed him to make a drastic decision. But Susan, a friend of Kenny's, wasn't buying it. She decided to look into things herself. She contacted the Clark County office to ask if Kenny's house had any debt attached to it. To her surprise, they told her there were no liens on the property. Kenny didn't owe anything on the house. This wasn't someone who was giving up, she thought. He had even applied for a new job just a week before he disappeared. He was trying to get a position at a company that installed solar panels. This didn't sound like someone who was planning to leave it all behind. Still, the mystery surrounding Kenny's disappearance grew. They didn't believe that he would suddenly end it all, especially not after all his hard work. It didn't make sense. They also pointed out that when Kenny's things were found near the mine, it didn't look like he left them there intentionally. Items like his keys and cell phone usually end up in our pockets, not just dropped and left behind. Maybe they fell out, or maybe someone had placed them there to mislead the search. Kenny's family, especially his nephew David, wasn't about to let it go. David wrote online that Kenny was one of the best people around. Kenny worked hard for everything he had, and he wasn't the type to just disappear without a reason. Sharon, Kenny's girlfriend, also got involved. She posted videos to her YouTube channel, showing happy moments with Kenny. One video even showed them hiking, laughing, and having a good time. It didn't match the idea of someone who was planning to vanish without a trace. The most interesting part of the story was the M Cave. According to Kenny, there was a mysterious cave he had stumbled upon during one of his hikes. He described it as having a strange, vibrating energy that scared him. He ran out of the cave, planning to return with a gun for protection. The cave became a legend. Search teams even mentioned it in their efforts to find Kenny. Over the years, many hikers set out to find the cave, hoping to discover what had happened to Kenny, or to locate the mysterious cave he had described. Some claimed to have found it, but no one could ever confirm it. The idea of the M Cave kept people talking, but it only added more questions. Why didn't Kenny take any pictures or video of the cave if he was so scared by it? Sharon said Kenny always carried his camera on hikes. So why, when faced with something as strange as the M Cave, didn't he take a picture? Some hikers, even when facing dangerous animals like mountain lions, are quick to pull out their phones and record. If something had happened to Kenny, why wasn't there any footage? Over the years, people kept searching, but no answers were found. Susan, however, believed Kenny wasn't as troubled as some thought. She didn't think he was in financial trouble or planning to end his life. She knew Kenny was an inventor with big ideas, even if they didn't always work out. He had plans for the future, plans to keep creating. To her, Kenny had a lot of life left to live. But the more people searched, the more they realized that Kenny's disappearance was a mystery that was far from being solved. While theories continued to flood the internet, the truth remained elusive. What happened to Kenny? Was it an accident, or was there something more sinister at play? No one knew for sure. All they had were pieces of a puzzle, with more questions than answers. Kenny's story wasn't over, but it was a story that would never be fully understood. The search for the truth continued, and the mystery of the M Cave lived on. Do not enter. For a water cave that even experienced divers would have a lot of trouble navigating, it would take a lot of nerve for divers who are not well experienced to dive in. The Blue Hole of Santa Rosa in New Mexico may seem like an unassuming pond at first glance, but don't let its calm, serene appearance fool you. Beneath the surface, this seemingly innocent body of water hides a very dark secret, one that would make anyone think twice before venturing too close. Hidden beneath the sparkling blue water is a metal grate, an unexpected gate that no one would expect in such a chill place. So buckle up as we dive into the chilling story of what lies beneath and what can happen if you dare to ignore the warning signs. Located about 100 miles east of Albuquerque, Santa Rosa may be a small town, but it holds a big attraction for curious travelers. One side of the city is well known for a swimming hole that, at first glance, seems like a peaceful pond, but that bad boy has something that would shake the bones of anyone who feels bad enough to explore the caves. Trees and rocks frame the water's edge, and the calm surface reflects the sky above. But don't let that fool you. The first thing that'll grab your attention is the deep blue color of the water. It's inviting, and it piques interest because the more you think, the more you want to see what's inside. This is no shallow pond. The water is so clear you can practically see all the way to the bottom, and that's exactly what makes it one of the most popular dive spots in the country. It is around the iconic Route 66, one of the original highways in the US. Stretching back to the 1920s, the Blue Hole has been a vital source of water for travelers and cattle crossing the desert long before the highway ever existed. Native populations have also used the hole for centuries, if not millennia, to cool off and replenish their water supplies. What makes this site so extraordinary is that the Blue Hole of Santa Rosa is a natural artesian well, a kind of spring where water flows from deep within the earth under pressure. This constant flow is what keeps the water crystal clear, replenishing itself every 6 hours. The flow rate here is truly astonishing, 3,000 gallons of water per minute. To put it into perspective, that's enough to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool in just under 3 hours. With no shortage of fresh, cool water, the Blue Hole is a dive paradise. It has an 80-foot diameter at the surface, but as you descend, the shape of the hole changes dramatically. It narrows like an hourglass, only to widen again at the bottom, which spans nearly 130 feet across. It's a wonder. This vast underground expanse is part of what makes the Blue Hole so fascinating, but also, it's what makes it so dangerous. At the bottom of the hole, among the boulders and rubble, are strange and unsettling objects. Bones, a crucifix, and a small opening on the eastern side of the cavern, now covered by a metal grate. This grate shields the entrance to a massive underwater cave system. And here's where things take a dark turn. The cave is not something to be taken lightly. It's a maze of corridors and rooms, formed over millennia by the slow erosion of soft rock. But the dangerous part is, you can't tell what the cave is like until you're inside. Despite the warnings, some divers couldn't resist the allure of the cave, and it wasn't long before disaster struck. Every year, thousands of students come from across the country to dive in the Blue Hole's crystal-clear waters. The site's calm conditions, with stable temperatures and no currents, make it an ideal spot for learning to dive. In March 1976, a group of 10 students from the University of Oklahoma arrived, ready to take advantage of these perfect conditions. The group, accompanied by their instructor, was planning to do underwater photography. It was supposed to be an ordinary day of diving, but fate had other plans. Around 10:30 a.m., with their scuba gear on and excitement in the air, the group descended into the blue hole. The instructor gave a standard set of instructions. Don't stay at the bottom too long, and under no circumstances should anyone venture into the cave entrance on the eastern side. For most of the group, those instructions were clear, but for two of the students, Mike and David, the warning was nothing but an invitation. As the others explored the open waters, Mike and David found themselves at the bottom of the hole, staring at the small, 4-foot-wide opening. Curiosity got the best of them. They exchanged glances and silently decided to explore. They ventured closer to the entrance, and as soon as they slipped into the cave, everything changed. The space inside was tight and claustrophobic, a stark contrast to the open, clear waters above. The jagged walls and sandy floor made it clear this was no safe, peaceful area to explore. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The water was no longer the sparkling blue they were used to, but instead murky and uneven. The air grew thicker, and the sense of danger heightened with each passing moment. But that wasn't enough to stop them. They pushed forward, eager to see what lay ahead, unaware that they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Mike and David kept pushing deeper into the cave, despite the growing sense of discomfort that was beginning to set in. After a 15-foot drop, they found themselves at the base of a narrow corridor. Ahead of them, the tunnel split into two paths, one veering forward and the other to the back at a sharp 60-degree angle. Behind them, the passage was a dead end, but ahead lay a new world to explore, dark, unknown, and filled with possibility. Little did they know, the path they chose would seal their fate. These tunnels weren't huge, but they weren't tiny either. Still, for divers without enough experience or proper training, navigating them could be tricky. Even the slightest wrong move could disturb the water, churning up the sand and silt on the bottom. When you're exploring, you're focused on what's in front of you, not noticing how your movements are making the water cloudier by the second. Mike and David kept swimming forward, unaware that with every stroke, they were blurring their way back out of the cave. It wasn't until they turned around that they realized the terrifying truth. The path back was now completely obscured, swallowed by a cloud of murky dust. In that disorienting cloud, panic began to set in. When you can't see anything, no direction, no way to tell up from down, the world feels like it's spinning out of control. Every instinct screams to find the way out, but with the water so thick with silt, you might as well be swimming blind. The pressure starts building. Your heart races, your breath is shallow, and before you know it, you're hyperventilating, thrashing around in blind panic. The movements become erratic, making the situation worse. You bang into the cave walls, the ceiling, every obstacle you never saw coming. Then, the inevitable happens. Your tank runs out of air, and it feels like you're breathing through a straw. But it's too late. You've already gone too deep, and now there's no way back. Up top, the instructor and other students soon realized something was terribly wrong. When Mike and David didn't return, the panic set in. Rescue divers were called in almost immediately, and within hours, they descended into the blue hole, setting up a 100-foot line to trace their way into the cave. The line was their only lifeline, a guide to find their way back no matter how badly the silt obscured the passage. They made it further into the cave than Mike and David had, but when they reached the first room, the situation became clearer. Mike's body was found near the entrance to one of the larger chambers. However, David was still nowhere to be found. At the time, cave diving was still in its infancy. Even the rescue teams were mostly made up of volunteers, many of whom hesitated to enter the cave due to its daunting depth and unpredictable conditions. The narrow, jagged tunnels only made the situation more dangerous. Only one diver could go in at a time, and even then, there was no guarantee they'd come back safely. But they pushed on. Days went by, and the search continued, each attempt to find David more difficult than the last. The divers went as deep as 181 feet, more than twice the depth they started from, but still, no sign of David. The conditions inside the cave were treacherous. The sheer size of the place made it impossible to see the bottom when shining a flashlight into the darkness. Divers would swim into massive chambers, and the beams of light would vanish into the void, unable to reach the depths. It wasn't just the visibility that was a problem, though. The underwater terrain was unstable. Divers moving through the tunnels were inadvertently dislodging rocks from the ceiling. In one terrifying instance, a diver was struck in the back by a rock nearly a foot wide. Another diver was grazed by one the size of a small car, hundreds of pounds of rock tumbling dangerously close. After 4 days, the search was called off. The water had grown too murky due to pressure changes on the surface, making it impossible to continue. A 300-pound metal grate was installed over the cave entrance, sealing it off to prevent any more accidents. But even with the grate in place, the mystery of David's disappearance remained. It wasn't until over a month later that the grate was temporarily removed, allowing divers to search once again. This time, they found David's body. The shocking part? David's body was found only at a depth of 130 feet, just a fraction of the depth the rescue team had already covered. There were so many rooms, passageways, and crevices to check that it took weeks to find him. Once his body was recovered, the grate was permanently reinstalled, and the blue hole remained sealed for nearly 40 years. For decades, the cave stayed off limits to anyone daring enough to explore. However, in 2013, a new hope emerged. The ADM Exploration Foundation, a group dedicated to cave exploration, contacted the city of Santa Rosa, hoping to get permission to map the cave that had been closed for so long. After receiving the necessary permits, their first task was to remove the metal grate. When it was finally pulled up, what they discovered was beyond shocking. The entrance was filled with rubble. Apparently, unbeknownst to the city, the army had dumped 2 truckloads of rocks and debris over the entrance years earlier. The divers had no choice but to dredge the bottom, carefully clearing away years of debris before they could even begin to think about entering the cave. But their progress was halted again by a massive boulder blocking the entrance, one so large it took another 3 years to remove. In 2016, the path was finally cleared. The legendary cave diver, Mike Young, and Navy diver Shane Thompson led a team of divers on an exploratory mission to map the cave. For several days, they painstakingly explored the tunnels, running fixed lines to ensure they could always find their way back. By March 26th, they had gone as deep as 195 feet, nearing the limits of what was safe to explore. They might have pushed deeper, but the work was becoming too difficult and the risks too great. What lay beyond those depths, they would never know. The blue hole of Santa Rosa remained a mystery, one that few would dare to explore, but for those who did, it was a haunting reminder of the dangers that lurk in the dark, hidden places of the world. The dive was far from ordinary. As Mike and Shane descended further into the cave, the terrain grew more treacherous. The usual watery tunnels now gave way to obstacles, a labyrinth of boulders and rocks that made the passage increasingly difficult. At about 140 feet down, the cave turned into a maze of giant rocks, some as large as cars, blocking their path. They weren't just swimming now. They were squeezing through tight cracks and gaps between massive, unstable boulders. The risk of disturbing the rocks was high, and every move had to be deliberate to avoid triggering a disaster. The further they went, the more the cave seemed to challenge them. For days, the duo had been navigating this perilous path, each step measured carefully. Up until the second-to-last day, it had been only Mike who could get through certain tight restrictions at 140 feet deep. Shane, despite his experience, found himself stopped by the tightness of the tunnels. But today was different. After days of struggle, Shane made it through, and they had decided to go deeper for one last check to make sure there were no hidden passages left unexplored. They reached the next restriction, tight but passable. The tunnel ahead opened up slightly, with enough space for them to move comfortably without stirring up too much silt. As they swam, Mike gestured to Shane to wait at the next tight passage while he went ahead to retrieve the line they had set earlier. It was a precautionary measure. Only one person could go through the next section due to its narrowness, so it made sense for Mike to go first, given his experience. Mike swam ahead, squeezing through a crack between 2 boulders. His fins disappeared into the darkness, leaving Shane in the relative quiet of the tunnel. Mike thought about checking the area thoroughly, and decided to retrieve the camera Shane had been wearing to document the journey. They were shooting a documentary about the blue hole, and Mike thought it'd be a great shot. However, as he turned around, he was met with the inevitable result of their careful movements: silt. The space was so tight that no matter how cautiously Mike moved, he was stirring up the fine dust that clouded the water, leaving him with zero visibility. He pressed on, determined to find the camera. But as he swam back through the restricted area, he collided with something unexpected. Shane. A few minutes earlier, Shane, defying their plan, had followed Mike into the narrow passage. The instinct to explore had overwhelmed him, and instead of waiting as they had agreed, he ventured after Mike. By the time they collided, Shane had already squeezed through 5 tight restrictions, but now he was stuck. Panic began to set in as he realized how wedged he was between the boulders. Mike, clearly taken aback, couldn't understand how Shane had managed to get through those spaces. Still, his first instinct was to help. He instructed Shane to turn around and head back, but Shane couldn't. The gap was too narrow, and his body was wedged in such a way that it was physically impossible for him to turn around. The panic escalated. Mike backed out of the opening, then reached in to grab Shane, pulling him as hard as he could. Every yank felt like it could break Shane's legs. But there was no time to worry about that. Mike had to get him out. After what felt like an eternity, Mike managed to pull Shane free, but the cave was not yet done with them. They had to continue their journey through the suffocating labyrinth of boulders, with Shane's safety hanging in the balance. As they made their way through the tight spaces, Mike felt the line. Shane was still with him, or so he thought. But suddenly, the line jerked out of his hands with a violent pull. Mike froze, his heart racing. He padded around frantically in the silt, trying to find it again. The line was his lifeline. Without it, he would have no way of knowing if Shane was still following him or if they were both lost in the chaos of the cave. Mike's breathing quickened as panic began to rise. He knew he had time, his equipment was good for hours, but the thought of being disoriented in the dark, flooded cave started to get to him. He had to stay calm. He took a deep breath, collected himself, and began to search once more, reaching out with careful fingers to feel for the line. It wasn't easy. The silt and the sheer bulk of the boulders made it nearly impossible to see or find anything. But after what felt like an eternity, Mike's hand brushed against something solid. It was the line. A rush of relief flooded through him, but the danger wasn't over. As he followed the line, trying to navigate his way out of the maze, something strange happened. Through a small gap in the rocks, Mike felt something. An arm. It was Shane's arm, reaching through the gap. And then Mike realized something even more alarming. Shane was in complete panic mode. The desperation was palpable. Mike could feel the tension in Shane's arm, and it was clear that Shane was beyond scared. With no time to waste, Mike grabbed the arm and started pulling Shane towards a larger opening nearby. He didn't care about the tightness of the tunnel anymore. It was all about getting Shane out of there before the panic completely overwhelmed him. Mike's heart pounded in his chest as he guided Shane through the smallest of spaces, making sure not to cause any more panic, but knowing that every second mattered. The cave was not forgiving, and neither were the circumstances. Every twist and turn in the narrow corridors brought them closer to the exit, but every moment felt like it could be their last. Finally, after what seemed like hours of tense struggle and painful progress, they made it through. The weight of the cave, the boulders, and the fear finally started to lift. The light of the surface, though distant, was in sight. They were going to make it out, alive, but barely. At that moment, Mike realized that the cave had changed them both. It had tested their limits, their resolve, and their ability to survive in the face of absolute darkness and terror. And as they finally reached the end of their dive, Mike knew one thing for sure. The cave had won this round, but they had escaped with their lives. The panic was evident in Shane as he scrambled toward the opening Mike had found. His mind was racing. He could see a way out, but his actions were frantic and erratic. As he lunged forward, Shane made the crucial mistake of crawling too quickly. In his blind panic, he wedged himself directly underneath Mike in the narrow tunnel. The two men were now in an even worse predicament. Shane's head was near Mike's feet, and Mike's head was by Shane's feet. They were completely stuck, and Shane's desperation made it worse. He began kicking his fins wildly, panicking further, forcing Mike to shield his face from the blows. In the chaos, Shane's fins slammed into a valve on Mike's suit, breaking it, and cold water immediately began filling Mike's suit. Mike could feel the pressure mounting. He knew the situation was dire, but he had to stay calm. He wedged one of his legs into a crack, creating just enough space for Shane to wiggle free. It wasn't easy. Shane's panicked movements had ripped one of Mike's fins off. Worse yet, the force of freeing himself pushed Shane even further through the opening. He was now ahead of Mike, but they were still trapped in the tunnel. Mike, struggling to regain his bearings, took a moment to calm himself. The freezing water in his suit wasn't helping, but the thought of getting out pushed him forward. Finally, Mike crawled out of the tight opening and began to search for a way forward. His hands frantically patted the rocks around him, and miraculously, he found his lost fin. It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep him going. He knew he couldn't stop now. He pushed on, feeling his way through the winding tunnels, constantly fighting the silt clouding his path. It was like trying to swim through fog. Every movement felt like a struggle. Then, out of nowhere, Mike felt something. A small opening. He squeezed through and found a little pocket of clearer water. As he swam toward it, the line he was following tugged back toward him. He felt it move, and relief washed over him. Shane was still alive, somewhere in the murky depths. But as quickly as that hope flared, it vanished. The line suddenly went slack, and Mike's heart sank. He knew instantly that Shane was gone. Mike's mind went into autopilot. He swam forward, heart pounding, and eventually found Shane's lifeless body wedged between boulders. The moment was surreal. He had to prepare Shane for retrieval, but he knew he couldn't stay down any longer. His suit was filled with water, and he still had to complete a decompression procedure before even thinking about surfacing. Mike reluctantly left Shane where he was and began his long, treacherous journey back through the cave, following the line. The twists and turns of the cave seemed endless, but finally, Mike emerged into the arms of the safety divers, waiting just above the entrance. He managed to communicate the devastating news. Shane wasn't coming back. With that, Mike began his 2-hour decompression process, each minute dragging on in agonizing stillness. The cold water, the panic from earlier, and the shock of losing Shane weighed heavily on him. It was a brutal experience, but he had no choice but to endure it. When Mike finally surfaced, the relief was mixed with a heavy sense of guilt and sorrow. As he warmed up, he started explaining what happened to the police. It was clear that Shane had made the wrong decision by following Mike into the cave against their plan. The footage from the cameras later revealed just how much Shane had been struggling. His breathing had become labored, and he quickly overwhelmed his respiratory system, forcing him to switch to emergency gas. But panic had taken over, and he never switched back. His suit was found torn apart, evidence of the frantic movements that had led to his undoing. The team, upon reviewing the footage and the conditions of the cave, concluded that Shane's actions were driven by panic. But the damage was done, and Mike knew that the expedition had come to a tragic end. The cave had been mapped, but not in the way they had hoped. What was once intended as a spot for local divers had turned into a tomb. The cave was deemed too dangerous to ever be used again. Even with the proper equipment, the risks of the narrow tunnels and unstable boulders were too great. One particular restriction was described by Mike as a small opening under a massive boulder, precariously balanced on a tiny lip of rock. It was a reminder of just how dangerous the cave really was. In the end, it was decided that the entrance to the cave would be sealed. A new grate was installed, blocking anyone from ever entering again. As for the Blue Hole of Santa Rosa, it remained open and safe for divers and swimmers, its beauty untouched by the dark history of the cave beneath it. Mike's journey was far from over, though. He knew he'd eventually have to go back down to retrieve Shane's body, but for now, the team insisted he wait until morning. The pressure of what had happened was overwhelming, and they all needed time to process the loss. But Mike was determined to bring his friend back, to close the chapter in the way it should have been. The cave's dark secrets remained, and the team's plans to map it were dashed. But through the tragedy, Mike came to understand just how unpredictable cave diving could be, and how even the best-laid plans could unravel in a split second. Despite the dangers, the experience shaped him in ways he would never forget.